Coming up on Arirang News. The power to choose and control technology is as important as the right to live and should be based on human dignity. This in remarks by President Yoon as he wraps up his 4-day state visit to the United Arab Emirates and heads to Switzerland for the Davos Forum. South Korea could become one of the few countries in the world with homegrown advanced supersonic fighter jets. Seoul's indigenous fighter jet, the KF-21, has successfully accomplished a supersonic test flight for the first time. In 2022, China saw its population drop for the first time in 60 years. This comes amid the Chinese economy having its worst performance in decades last year, in part because of COVID-19 lockdowns. Good evening. It's 9 p.m. here in South Korea, and thank you for joining us on Arirang News. We begin with South Korean President Yoon wrapping up his visit to the UAE and now heading to Switzerland for the Davos Forum. Before taking off, he had the chance to share his vision for the future of humanity and to reaffirm what South Korea and the UAE have been discussing on his trip there. Our Kim Do-yeon is traveling with the president and files this report from Abu Dhabi.
The important thing is we have the power to choose, said South Korean President Yoon as he shared his ideas about humanity's future. To those who pursue peace and prosperity, he said, this right to choose and control technology is as important as the right to live.
주어진 권한을 바르게 사용하기 위해서는 우리가 나아가야 할 올바른 미래를 먼저 설계하고 기준이 반드시 필요한 것입니다. 어떠한 일이 있어도 포기할 수 없고 포기해서는 안 되는 가치가 인간의 존엄입니다.
This came as he attended Tuesday's Future Vision Forum in Dubai at the city's Museum of the Future, one of his last stops on this trip. Just before he left the UAE, he also sat down with Dubai's ruler and Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum to reaffirm what the two countries discussed during the summit, expanding their cooperation in multiple areas. The Prime Minister especially showed his appreciation for South Korea's support for UAE's hosting the upcoming COP28 and said he looks forward to tackling climate change together. That wrapped up President Yoon's state visit to UAE. Among the many events on this 4-day trip was a bilateral summit on Sunday, which a joint statement documents and specifies what was agreed as the two leaders decided to further develop their country's special strategic partnership. This agreement also strengthens cooperation in 4 key areas, namely conventional and clean energy, including the peaceful use of nuclear energy, as well as economy, investment and defense technology, and expanding further into space development, emerging industries, and culture. Also reaffirmed in the statement is their shared goal of the complete denuclearization of North Korea and promoting peace in the Middle East. And most importantly, as President Yoon emphasized that this trip was for South Korea's economy, the statement included $30 billion of investment in South Korea, solidifying that the 48 MOUs that have been signed between the two countries are not empty promises. Now, President Yoon is heading to Switzerland for the Davos Forum before heading home to celebrate Seollal, the Korean Lunar New Year holiday. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News, Abu Dhabi.
South Korea's KF-21 fighter jet has successfully flown at supersonic speed, reaching a new milestone in the development of the country's indigenous aircraft. According to the Defense Acquisition Program Administration, a KF-21 prototype surpassed the speed of sound March 1, or about 1,200 kilometers per hour for the first time on Tuesday. It took off from Sacheon Air Base and flew at an altitude of about 4,000 feet over the country's southern waters. Since 2015, Seoul has been developing its own military aircraft using domestic technology. It aims to start mass producing the KF-21 from 2026. The South Korean government has said Victims of Japan's wartime forced labor still waiting for court decisions can also be compensated through a public foundation. This comes after the government last week revealed controversial plans to compensate the victims through a domestic fund. Bae-eun-ji has more.
Last week, the South Korean government revealed plans to compensate Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor through a public foundation, instead of the assets of the accused Japanese firms. In a briefing to Parliament on Tuesday, South Korea's foreign ministry said this way of compensation can also be applied to pending cases filed by the victims, in addition to the 3 finalized court rulings.
We believe a similar approach is possible for pending cases if the court rules in favor of the plaintiff.
But the victims and the civic groups supporting them have been protesting against the government's plan, saying this issue cannot be resolved without sincere apologies and participation from the Japanese companies. Of the total number of lawsuits filed over wartime forced labor, only 3 have been finalized in court, and 67 cases are still pending. In 2018, the Supreme Court made landmark rulings ordering 2 Japanese companies, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Nippon Steel, to compensate the Korean victims of forced labor during Japanese colonial rule. Earlier in the day, to boost bilateral ties, South Korea's President Yoon acknowledged that relations between Seoul and Tokyo have recently shown clear improvements after years of tension. These remarks were made on behalf of the president by the first vice foreign minister at the 56th joint meeting of the Korea-Japan and Japan-Korea Cooperation Committees held in Seoul. Yoon's message mentioned that South Korea and Japan are the closest and most important neighbors, and that they require cooperation in all fields, including security and the economy. In a message delivered by Japan's ambassador to South Korea on Tuesday, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida also pledged to work toward improving bilateral relations by promptly resolving pending issues. Bae-eun-ji, Arirang News.
It's now almost 3 months since the crowd crush that claimed 159 lives in Seoul, and this afternoon at the National Assembly, opposition lawmakers adopted a final report as they concluded a special parliamentary probe into the tragedy, a decision the nation's ruling party refused to accept. Our National Assembly correspondent Han Sung-woo was there.
South Korea's parliamentary investigation into the deadly Halloween crowd crush in Seoul has come to an end, with the nation's 3 main opposition parties unilaterally adopting a final report on the probe's findings. Before its adoption at a special committee meeting at the National Assembly on Tuesday, lawmakers from the ruling People Power Party left the room after a heated exchange with the main opposition Democratic Party of Korea. The opposition's claim in the report that Interior Minister Lee Sang-min, who's being pressured by opposition lawmakers to resign, is responsible for the Itaewon tragedy, was slammed by the ruling party as a political scheme.
This probe began with the opposition's intent of laying all the blame on the Yoon Suk-yeol administration. And until now, they've been bringing the issue of perjury into question just to oust Minister Lee Sang-min, a transparent trick aimed at collecting evidence to kick him out.
We've clearly established through this probe that the government did not do anything right in terms of disaster management, from prevention and preparation to response and restoration. And Minister Lee Sang-min is the one responsible for all of this.
Also included in the report are accusations of perjury against not only Minister Lee, but several other officials, including the chief of the Presidential Office's Situation Room for State Affairs, Han Ho-seop, and National Police Agency Commissioner General Yoon. Also present in the committee room before being escorted out for disturbing proceedings were a few members of the bereaved families, who screamed at ruling party lawmakers for refusing to adopt the report. Han Sung-woo, Arirang News.
On Monday, 18 lawmakers at the National Assembly gathered at a meeting under the name of the Group for Bipartisan Political Reform. There, they set goals to eliminate the confrontations between the ruling and opposition parties, which they say are driven by the current electoral system, and more specifically, how electoral districts are divided. Lee Si-woo explains further.
The next general election in South Korea is April 10th of 2024. And all electoral districts for that election have to be finalized a year ahead of time, so by April 10th this year. That's why the Group for Bipartisan Political Reform gathered on Monday and is planning to officially launch on the 30th of this month, with more members joining. Also at the National Assembly is a special committee on political reform, which too is discussing the matter of electoral reform. Right now, our current system of electoral districts is based on single-member districts. As the name suggests, the single-member districts elect one single officeholder per district. In contrast, when you have multi-member districts, the smaller single districts are combined to create a larger district with several representatives. These could be the three candidates in the larger district who have the first, second, and third most votes. President Yoon said in his New Year interview with a local newspaper that the winner-takes-all single-member district system has made the election too competitive, and South Korea could possibly consider electing two or more officeholders per district. When we elect one officeholder per district, some candidates could get large numbers of votes and still narrowly lose. This means there are a lot of what's called wasted votes, or votes for the losing candidates, so many people might feel their voice is not being represented. In contrast, when we elect multiple people per district, there are fewer wasted votes. But that's not to say there aren't any limitations to this system. Combining smaller districts into one means that remote rural regions with a low population density may be combined with urban regions with a higher population density. In such cases, political candidates may focus their campaigns on the urban regions, coming up with platforms that cater to those in the cities, which will marginalize those in rural regions. Also, having too many candidates on the ballot may cause unnecessary confusion for voters. The election will also cost more. Electoral reform may mean that many of the legislators elected under the current system may lose their seats if the change is applied. The Group for Bipartisan Political Reform say that a total of around 70 lawmakers will gather together on January 30th. But eyes are on what decisions the rest of the parliament, the 230 or so other members, will make. Lee Si-hoo, Arirang News.
Health authorities and related experts held their first round of talks today to decide on the fate of the indoor mask mandate. The time when the rule will be lifted is planned to be announced this Friday, just before the Lunar New Year holiday. Our Shin Se-byuk has the latest.
South Korean health authorities are set to discuss whether to end the rule on indoor mask wearing on Tuesday. The indoor mask mandate is the last remaining antivirus measure left in the country. In December, the government said that mask wearing would no longer be required, but rather recommended in public places, except for high-risk facilities such as hospitals and public transportation, if 2 out of 4 criteria were met. The criteria include a stable number of new infections, a downward trend in critically ill cases and death, sufficient medical response capabilities, and a boost in the vaccination rate among people aged 60 years old and above, as well as those working in or residing at high-risk facilities. As of now, 3 out of these 4 requirements have been met, with the exception of the booster take-up by older people. And watchers say the mandate could be dropped as soon as after the upcoming Lunar New Year holiday, which runs from January 21st to the 24th. In fact, on Monday, the head of the National Advisory Committee on Infectious Disease Crisis Response, Chung Ki-seok, said South Korea's infection trend has shown significant signs of subsiding, and lifting the indoor mask mandate is not far away. Chung also said he expects the infection trend to stay at around the current level even after restrictions are lifted. Meanwhile, South Korea on Tuesday added 40,199 new COVID-19 cases, the lowest for a Tuesday in 13 weeks. Shin Se-byuk, Arirang News.
The Lunar New Year holiday, or Seollal as it's known in Korean, starts this weekend, so the government has come up with some new measures to ensure public safety and improve transportation. Itaewon has more.
It's going to be a 4-day weekend from this Saturday for the Lunar New Year, or Seollal.
And the government and the ruling People Power Party have prepared some measures to improve public transport and safety.
A cold wave is expected next week, and so the government aims to establish safety measures for people who plan to visit their family this Seollal holiday.
In terms of medical care, the government has asked some 410 urgent care centers and 115 other facilities to operate around the clock. It's asking neighborhood hospitals and pharmacies to open during the holiday too. For fire prevention, the government has declared a special monitoring period from this Friday to ensure safety at over 1,660 traditional markets and around 60 low-income neighborhoods with makeshift dwellings called 쪽방, which typically lack fire safety equipment. There will be further measures announced for crowd safety at places like traditional markets and subways too. And from the National Police Agency, measures to prevent drunk driving. The Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport expects around 26.4 million people to travel this Seollal. That's a little over half the population. This is up 2.1% compared to last year, which is why the ministry is going to work with bus companies to get 20% more long-distance buses on the roads and have them run more frequently. There will be more car drivers on the roads as well, around 5.1 million per day, an increase from a year earlier of 24%.
All expressways will be toll-free during the 4 days, and the National Police Agency will work with local governments to crack down on traffic violations. Roads will also be cleared of snow and ice.
The Korea Transport Institute meanwhile said roads heading out of Seoul into the provinces will see heavy traffic early on Saturday, while the heaviest return traffic will be Monday afternoon. To get from Seoul to Busan by car at peak traffic is expected to take 8 hours and 40 minutes and a little less the other way. That's more than 2 hours longer than it took last year. Itaewon, Arirang News.
There are currently 170 trillion Korean won in circulation. That's the equivalent of around 137 billion US dollars. The Bank of Korea said Tuesday that as of the end of last year, the amount of cash in circulation had only risen about 4% from a year earlier, the lowest rise in 18 years. A robust currency flow in the markets usually signals a healthy growing economy, but a tepid rise in circulating currency could be concerning, as the last time South Korea saw a rise of below 5% was during the 2008 global financial crisis. Sales of electric vehicles hit a global milestone last year, achieving around 10% market share for the first time. According to data released by automotive industry-focused data providers, global electric vehicle sales hit 7.8 million units in 2022, up 68% compared to the previous year. This was mainly driven by solid growth in China and Europe as the technology goes mainstream there. Data showed EV sales accounted for 19% of car sales in China and 11% in Europe last year. But some experts say this level of sales in the EV market may not be sustainable this year, as a number of countries, including Germany, are reducing electric car subsidies. One of the world's most populous countries, China, has seen its population drop for the first time in more than 6 decades. The news comes along with weak growth in the country's GDP. Kim Hyun-sung fills you in.
China's population has fallen for the first time in 61 years. The population shrank by about 850,000 from the previous year, according to China's National Bureau of Statistics on Tuesday. And in 2022, the birth rate dropped to a record low, fewer than 7 births per 1,000, the lowest since the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. China has also been seeing a shriveling working-age population. The number of people aged 16 to 59 has fallen by 50 million in just over a decade, going from a peak of 925 million in 2011 to just below 876 million in 2022. Authorities for years have been concerned about how the shrinking labor force will strain the Chinese economy, prompting policymakers to scrap the notorious one-child policy back in 2016. But it seems that move wasn't enough to turn around China's falling population. This news comes amid China's recent economic slump. China's GDP grew by 3% in 2022. It's the second weakest growth since 1976, only slightly better than the 2.4% growth seen in 2020, the first year of the pandemic. Forecasters expect growth to bounce back to a moderate 5% this year, but there are some hurdles like slowing exports that could stop China from building momentum.
The foundation for the domestic economy to recover is not solid enough, and there are still quite a lot of challenges for the production and operation of companies.
The world's factory and second biggest economic powerhouse, China, is struggling to get its economy moving. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
This year's World Economic Forum, hosted since the 1970s, kicks off again in Davos, Switzerland. Under the theme of cooperation in a fragmented world, heads of states and business leaders from around the world are discussing pressing issues like inflation and the war in Ukraine. But it started off with a meeting on the deepening climate crisis. Jung Eun-ju has more.
The World Economic Forum returned to Davos, Switzerland for its first in-person meeting in 2 years on Monday and will continue until Friday. Under the theme of cooperation in a fragmented world, the meeting will center on issues such as geo-economic challenges, stagnant economic growth, and the deepening climate crisis. The meeting will also emphasize topics related to 5 fields: the current energy and food crisis, the world's high inflation, low growth, and high debt economy, industry headwinds, social vulnerabilities, and geopolitical risks. The WEF said attendees will look at these in the context of a new system for dialogue and cooperation in a multipolar world.
We need that transfer of information and knowledge and innovation across borders to be able to lift living standards for all. So that has to be one core part of the discussions here.
More than 600 CEOs will be in town, and so will 51 heads of state and government, including South Korea's President Yoon and the leaders of Spain, Poland, and the Philippines. Davos 2023 kicked off with climate change on top of the agenda, as this year's unusually warm winters brought an unprecedented snow shortage to the Swiss town. Many other ski resorts in the Alps are struggling to stay open due to a lack of snow. The forum also brought up concerns that extreme weather exacerbates the risk of infectious diseases. Meanwhile, ahead of the World Economic Forum, the Swiss president had invited culture ministers from 31 European countries to launch the new Davos Baukultur Alliance to create more sustainable and climate-friendly buildings and urban landscapes. Baukultur is shorthand for the preservation and development of quality, sustainable, and culturally relevant buildings and cities. The alliance was created to pursue goals set out in the so-called Davos Declaration, aimed at high-quality Baukultur for Europe, which was adopted in 2018. Jung Eun-ju, Arirang News.
Spells of frigid weather will take over again tomorrow. Although morning temperatures will rise a tad, conditions will still be cold at -4 degrees Celsius in Seoul. Keep in mind that minus figures will continue to prevail for the morning for the remainder of the week. Cold winds will also accompany at times, and overall readings will feel a couple notches lower. Light snowfall is currently coming and going across inland regions. For central regions, including here in Seoul, expect about 1 centimeter. Jeollado province and manus regions of Jeju Island will see light snowflakes flying around. This round of snowfall will last until tomorrow dawn. For those driving, please be extra careful out on the roads because they will be slippery. Tomorrow, Seoul will be starting off at -4 degrees and Daegu at -2. Daily highs in Seoul will get up to 3 degrees. Daejeon 4, Busan will be reaching 7 degrees Celsius. On Saturday, which is the first day of the Lunar New Year holiday, temperatures will be plunging significantly. That's all for now, and here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is all for today's newscast. Thank you for staying with us. We'll be back with the most up-to-date news tomorrow. Good night.